Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gordon Kendall. I am a member of the Fashion Committee of the National Arts Club. For those of you who aren't aware of the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 not-for-profit arts organization based in the Gramercy Park area of New York City. And over the past year, we have developed a very exciting virtual program with exciting guests, new interesting topics about fashion and fashion curation, fashion production, and fashion textiles today. And if the name Ponchitas Petunias and Courtney the Lion and Hebe Zeebies mean anything to you like they do to me, I'm happy to say that we have Susan Brown. She is the Associate Curator of Textiles for the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. And she has a fascinating presentation, very appropriate for summer, very appropriate for Lilly lovers, about Susie Zuzak for Lilly Pulitzer. And without further ado, we have a wonderful show for you, thanks to her great presentation. And Susan, tell us.
Thank you, Gordon, for the introduction. I am so delighted to be invited here today to share with you the story of two remarkable women, Lilly Pulitzer, the wealthy socialite turned fashion designer who pioneered a uniquely American style, and Susie Zuzek, the textile designer whose wild, colorful prints made Pulitzer's clothes distinctive, collectible, and fun. Since I'm addressing the fashion group, I'm going to guess that one of those names is much more familiar to you than the other. I'm hoping to change that today. From 1962 until 1985, the period when Lilly Pulitzer owned the Lilly Pulitzer Company, Susie Zuzak was the woman behind the scenes, creating the exuberant printed fabrics that were really the signature of the brand. Now, fashion designers are notoriously secretive about where they source their fabrics. So sadly, this is not an uncommon scenario. But what makes this story so compelling is that the Lilly look was defined from the very beginning by the prints. And those prints were designed almost exclusively by one person, Susie Zuzak. Susie and Lilly's backgrounds could not have been more different, but through a series of strange and serendipitous events, their lives intersected at a tiny little shop in downtown Key West called Key West Handprint Fabrics. In 1960, this handsome couple from New York, Jim Russell and Peter Pell, were in Miami. Pell was a stage manager who had been the road manager for Tallulah Bankhead, and Russell was a dancer choreographer. And they were working on a production of On the Town at the Coconut Grove Playhouse. After the run of the show, they took a trip to Key West to go diving and fishing with Walter Starkey, a former Broadway producer they knew from New York. Starkey was involved in Key West historic preservation and had recently purchased Harbor House at 423 Front Street, a brick building trimmed with wrought iron that had housed the city's first bank. The largely abandoned building had a struggling screen printing operation on its second floor, with a single 30-foot printing table. Starkey persuaded Pell and Russell to invest in it, and they moved to Key West. In December 1961, they opened Key West Handprint Fabrics, with the screen printing upstairs and a retail shop on the ground floor, selling fabrics by the yard and a variety of small items like bags and hats made from the printed fabrics. Neither Pell nor Russell had any experience in textile design or manufacturing, and pretty soon they were struggling too. But luck found them in the form of three women, Susie Zuzak, Lilly Pulitzer, and Jackie Kennedy. Susie Zuzak was the daughter of Yugoslavian immigrants and the youngest of 5 children. She grew up on a dairy farm in Gowanda, New York, just outside of Buffalo. Her father died when she was 12 years old, so everyone had to pitch in with farm work. Susie loved to draw from a very early age, and her older sisters indulged her by saving scraps of paper for her. But it is very unlikely that she would have had the opportunity to go to college if she had not enlisted in World War II. She and her sister joined the WACS, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and she served at Camp Beale in California. Clearly, her farming background came in handy, at least for the purposes of this photo shoot. After the war, she was eligible to attend college on the GI Bill, and she and her sister moved to New York to attend the Pratt Institute. Susie wanted to be a commercial illustrator, but one of her teachers recommended that she try textile design, and it was clear that she had a talent for it. She graduated at the top of her class in 1949, but even before graduating, she found work designing fabrics for fashion and interiors for New York firms like Herman Blanc. After she married and had children, the family moved to her husband's hometown of Key West. She tried to continue freelancing with the companies she was designing for in New York, and she traveled back there several times, but in those days it was a pretty arduous commute. She and her husband had separated, and she was raising 3 young daughters on her own, and she needed money. So when Peter Pell and Jim Russell approached her to design for Key West handprint fabrics, she gladly accepted the position. As soon as she came on board in early 1962, she set the style for the company's fabrics, densely packed designs with an eclectic mix of Key West flora and fauna. The Florida Development Commission wrote, "The beautiful designs and colors that the talented artist turned out were soon attracting the attention of all who came to the shop." Or, as former employee Bobby McKenzie put it, with Susie, their designs opened up. They were free. They were what I would call happy. That may sound crazy, but you know what I mean. You look at them and you can't help but smile. Just a couple of months later, in the spring of 1962, Lilly Pulitzer walked in the door. The Lilly Pulitzer Company's origin story begins with a juice stand, which seems an unlikely place to find the heiress to some of America's largest fortunes. Lilly's great-grandfather, Jabez Bostwick, was one of the original founders of Standard Oil. In 1952, when she was 21, Lilly eloped with Peter Pulitzer, whose grandfather, Joseph Pulitzer, had made his fortune in publishing and is known to most of us by his namesake prizes in literature and journalism. Lilly had grown up spending the season in Palm Beach, but she and Peter chose to make Florida their year-round home. Peter owned several citrus groves, and Lilly decided to start a juice bar on Via Misner, just off Worth Avenue, the upscale shopping street in Palm Beach. Squeezing juices was wreaking havoc on her wardrobe, so she had her dressmaker sew up some simple shift dresses in what I call cheap and cheery prints that would hide the stains. Perhaps that was one secret of her success. She designed this dress for herself, a woman running her own business, raising young children, and keeping up a rather notorious social life. This was around 1959, and most women's fashion still focused on the cinched waist that had dominated fashion since the end of the war and the introduction of Christian Dior's new look. Pulitzer's shift, known as the Lilly, was forgiving. It was body skimming, but not tight or constricting, with side slits for mobility. It was lined, so you didn't have to wear a slip, and the high slits made it basically impossible to wear stockings and garters. The Lilly was almost always shown with bare legs and flat sandals, as you see Lilly wearing it here. In her essay in the book, Caroline Reynolds Milbank argues that the Lilly was the transition between the buttoned-up 50s and the free-spirited 60s. It came in 2 lengths, above the knee and mid-thigh, paving the way for the miniskirt. It managed to be conservative and daring at the same time, with its obvious lack of foundation garments and above-the-knee hemline. But most importantly, those patterns, colorful, eclectic, a little bit loud even, gave the whole thing an irreverent, tongue-in-cheek tone that became synonymous with the Lilly Pulitzer style. Soon, Lilly started making shift dresses for her friends, and then, before you know it, she was selling more dresses than juice at her juice stand. She needed a reliable fabric supplier, not just the local 5 and dime. Just at the point that she was ready to make this important next step in her business, she discovered Key West handprint fabrics. Actually, her mother and sister had discovered the shop and sent some swatches to Lilly. When Lilly arrived at the store, she ordered 300 yards of fabric on the spot and changed her order to 3,000 yards when she got back home. Here you see her wearing a Lilly shift and carrying an armload of Key West handprint swatches, which became a very familiar sight in Key West after this. She was Key West Handprint's first wholesale client, and they were her first supplier, and it was a match that changed the trajectory of both companies. The marriage of Lilly's casual classic sportswear with Zuzek's exuberant prints defined a style that endures to this day. But that's not all, because that same summer of 1962, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, who at that time was the most influential woman in American fashion, was photographed on at least 3 separate occasions wearing a Lilly shift. On a trip to Italy with her sister that was covered in Life magazine, posed with her husband and children at the Kennedy family compound at Hyannisport, and again that summer greeting the president arriving at Squaw Island off Cape Cod. As first family, the Kennedys introduced a new level of informality to the White House. They were photographed sailing and water skiing and playing with their children and dogs. Yet you could never accuse Jackie of not being correctly dressed, although the press did report when she went to church sleeveless. Their lifestyle, especially at Hyannisport, was the embodiment of the kind of casual elegance Lilly Pulitzer was selling. The Kennedy connection was like a match to kindling, and the Lilly Pulitzer brand took off, and Key West handprint fabrics right along with it. They were both just starting out in business, and they grew up together. As Susie simply put it, they made her and she made them. Lilly Pulitzer quickly expanded beyond shift dresses into minis for the girls, and then a complete resort wear line for women and men, all using the same whimsical prints designed by Susie Zuzak. It was very much geared towards the resort crowd, with swimwear, clothes for golf and tennis, and casual day into evening clothes, all in sun-drenched colors with white accents that seemed designed to show off a tan. The back of that men's stuff flyer reads, quote, "Truly, boys, if you've been dying to pitch your gray flannels into oblivion, this is your big chance. Females everywhere will never be able to thank you enough," which captures the chatty, clubby tone of her promotional materials and her positioning of the brand as the antidote to the 1950s man in the gray flannel suit. And it was sort of a club. Because of the prints, the clothes were recognizable from across the room and carried with them the whiff of Palm Beach or Newport. Her ad campaign, Lilly Follows the Sun, was photographed on location in exotic locales and created a fantasy of perpetual vacation, following the party from one resort spa to the next. Photo shoots featuring herself, her family, and her family homes contributed to the aspirational quality of the brand, suggesting that you too could live like Lilly. In reality, a Lilly shift was about a third of the price of a dress from Pucci, the other print-driven brand that was often dubbed the uniform of the jet set. She also introduced unisex Pulitzer jeans, or PJs. Again, Caroline Milbank makes a compelling argument in the book that these were the first commercially successful unisex fashions. Vogue reported, quote, "The newest rage at debutante and college parties is Lilly Pulitzer's bright silk-screened velveteen Pulitzer jeans worn with a black tie and dinner jacket. They're for men until women bought them." Lilly's home goods line offered drapery and upholstery fabrics, cushions, and table linens. I think probably for the first and last time, Lord & Taylor swapped out their awnings along Fifth Avenue for Susie Zuzak prints to celebrate their release, dedicating their entire bank of windows to promoting this line. Pulitzer's clothing in Zuzak's prints became collectible almost immediately, and devoted customers would line up when new shipments were expected so that they could buy the latest prints. One of the store managers said, It's become sort of a cult to own one. Some of our customers collect the different fabric designs as though it were a hobby. They get one of every new design we turn out. The company put out new prints so frequently that they couldn't print catalogs fast enough. And the Lilly Pulitzer order form notoriously asked the buyer to specify a color and wild or mild. The exact design would be a surprise. And maybe that worked to their advantage. You really had the sense that you were getting something straight from the drawing board, Susie Zuzak's drawing board. And as you can see from this image of women shopping for jeans, there was definitely an aesthetic of abundance, of having just a treasure trove of crazy prints to choose from. I'll bet you can't pick just one. Key West handprint fabrics had to scramble to keep up with the demand from Pulitzer. By 1966, they were providing 250,000 yards of fabric per year. Now remember, when they first opened, they were selling tea towels and tote bags to tourists, so they really weren't set up for that kind of volume. First, they installed 2 additional tables at Harbor House and instituted shift work to keep those tables operating 24 hours a day. In 1967, they moved into a custom-built factory at 529 Front Street, which today is the Pier House Hotel. The new factory had 5 60-yard tables and 2 70-yard tables, allowing an 8-fold increase in production. By 1970, the new factory was putting out more than 1 million yards of fabric per year and was the largest employer in Key West, beating out the Navy, which had dominated the local economy for decades. The company became both an economic anchor for downtown Key West and a major tourist attraction, welcoming up to 2,000 visitors a day. The shop, which was already an explosion of color and pattern, had a big picture window looking out over the printing floor, so you could watch the fabrics being printed. You could even go down there and talk to the printers as they worked. You had the sense of being completely immersed in Susie Zuzak's imaginative world. And Susie kept churning out patterns. During her 25 years with the company, she created over 1,500 original designs. Many people associate the Pulitzer brand with tropical florals, but the original prints were beloved for a reason. They were far more eclectic and whimsical than just florals. She created designs of Roman coins, heraldry, scrimshaw, pirate ships, and weather vanes. Everything about Key West was new to Susie: the landscape, the plants and animals, the architecture, all of which made its way into her designs. She was also a sculptor who often used sea glass in her work, so she scoured the beach regularly and was often inspired by what she saw there. Here is an early design of sea glass bottles from 1964. And here, a variety of other sea creatures, including fish, shells, and pelicans, but she also did designs with lobster pots, fish nets, crabs, and sandpipers. I have found her animal-based patterns to be the most surprising and delightful. Susie was a huge animal lover, and she kept a menagerie in the middle of downtown Key West with peacocks, goats, cats, rabbits, even a monkey named Trinket, who wasn't really a pet. She had her own little door and came and went as she pleased. Animal prints like leopard skin were very popular in the 1960s and 70s, but not so much prints with animals in them. Susie occasionally used tiger stripes or giraffe spots as the background of a design, but she always included the tiger or the giraffe too. I think she was incapable of even suggesting in a print that you could skin such a creature. She never had the opportunity to travel to Africa, but she studied books of African wildlife and incorporated them into her patterns, drawing them with the same affection you would a household pet. Even her floral designs are extremely varied. Some loose, impressionistic sketches in watercolor, others ink drawings of botanical precision. She said she still preferred the northern flowers she had grown up with, and she created many designs based on daisies, poppies, and Queen Anne's lace. But she was also inspired by tropical species, even a night-blooming cactus that grew in her front yard, which you can see on the upper right. The vegetable garden was also a constant source of inspiration, and some of her favorite designs were those based on cabbage, corn, beets, mushrooms, apples, oranges, and pea pods. In addition to finding inspiration around her, she also made reference to the history of textiles. One of her favorite things to do when she lived in New York was to visit the unicorn tapestries. This style of tapestry, with tiny flowers completely filling the background, is called mille fleurs, or thousand flowers. I've often thought that term could apply to many of Susie's designs, but the handling of the lion in this design especially reminds me of the unicorn resting in a garden. Other designs reference 18th century copperplate printed fabrics, often called toile de Jouy for the French town where they were manufactured by Oberkampf, but here with a Key West twist and color palette. She also found inspiration in the cashmere shawl, both the paisley form itself and the practice of filling every space with more pattern, something she did with paisley patterns like the one on the right, and with other kinds of patterns. Here are two of my favorite examples of patterns where every open space, including the lobster shell and the rhino's hide, is filled with roses, tiny leaves, vines, and flowers. And sometimes she saw the paisley form in other things, like walruses, penguins, or squashes. It's one of my favorite Susie Zuzak effects, creating designs that would read one way from a distance, but offer a surprise when you got up close. Susie's style was perfectly suited to screen printing. Everyone said she had a loose hand, and minor misregistrations in the printing would not mar the design. They are beautiful watercolor drawings, and if you're in New York between now and January 2nd, I hope you'll take the opportunity to come see them in person. But in spite of their spontaneous feeling, they're also working documents. Each design repeats horizontally and vertically. So for example, the zebra body at the bottom fits on the zebra legs at the top, and the tail feathers of the ostrich on the left are completed on the right edge. Many of the drawings have pencil notations with technical notes for the printers. For example, on this drawing, along the top, you see pencil lines indicating the screen breaks. When you're printing, you don't want the pattern to break in the middle of a solid color area because a misregistration could leave a white line. So each of the pencil lines you see there is carefully snaking around a single color. Susie was skilled at the use of fall-on, overlapping translucent inks to create additional colors without adding to the cost of the printing. Wonder World is a 7-color design created with just 4 screens. Peter, who was in charge of choosing the colorways for the printed fabrics, was less skilled and sometimes ended up with murky results. So that eventually Lilly said, no more fall on, which is unfortunate, but Susie found many other ways to lend depth and complexity to her designs. By 1963, the Lilly shifts were already so popular that they were being copied. After some shifts and their Zuzek prints were copied by another Florida dressmaker, Key West Handprint Fabrics sued successfully for copyright infringement. After that, Pulitzer requested that her name be incorporated into all the prints she used. The name Lilly can be found in many of the drawings, sometimes in decorative looping script, as you see on the right, and at other times more quietly concealed in the drawing, like the pale gray lilies on the left. The cover of the book actually has a tiny notation that says, "Put a lily," which made me laugh because all the people who worked in the studio said adding lilies was a never-ending task. Susie's designs often began with detailed pen and ink line work, drawn in India ink on 100% cotton rag paper. She used bright, but usually naturalistic colors. She preferred Dr. P.H. Martin's concentrated watercolor inks. In my personal opinion, the beauty of her line work was sometimes obscured by the day-glow colorways that were chosen for the printed fabrics. But clearly, it was a successful strategy. The sun-bleached effect was part of the endless summer appeal of the brand. But that said, having the opportunity to see the original artwork is really very special. Translating the spontaneous quality of Susie's original drawings to printed yardage required a team of skilled workers. In screen printing, each color in the finished print requires its own screen. So a technician would lay a sheet of transparent film over the drawing and trace over all the elements to be printed in a particular color. As with most things, there's an art to it, to capturing the quality of line in order to retain the hand-drawn feeling. Next, a photographer transfers these hand-drawn films into printed acetates, putting the design into repeat. The design can be enlarged or reduced at this stage, but most of Susie's patterns were printed at a 1-to-1 scale. And here you can see the irregular edges created by working around those color areas. Silk screens, which are actually nylon, stretched over a wooden or aluminum frame, are coated with a photographic emulsion. The acetates serve as negatives placed between the emulsion and a light source. Where the light passes through the acetate, the emulsion is exposed and hardens, and where the light is blocked, the emulsion washes away, forming a stencil of the area to be printed. The ink is poured into the screen and then forced through the mesh with a squeegee. The fabric is stretched down a long table, and the printers work their way along, printing a single color. By the time they get to the end of the 70-yard table, the ink is dry back at the beginning, so they start again, printing the second color, and so on until all the color layers are put down to build up the pattern. Each pattern was printed in 5 to 12 different colorways. Key West handprint was part of a larger movement toward hand screen printing in the post-war period. Compared to roller printing, which had been the dominant technology before the war, the upfront investment is very modest, and the immediacy of the translation from the artist's hand to the finished product resulted in an explosion of small, artist-driven studios, including Dee Dee and Leslie Tillett in New York, who were also favorites of Jackie Kennedy, Angelo Testa, Ruth Adler Schnee, and Ben Rose in Chicago, and Harward and Sophie Steger in New Mexico, among many others. They owned and operated their own studios, though, so they have been a little bit less invisible than Susie, at least within the field of textile history. Although Lilly Pulitzer was by far their largest client, Key West Handprint Fabrics also supplied Roxanne swimwear and had its own house brand of clothing designed by former costume designer Virginia Pierce, working under the name Vanda. In this photo, you see Jim Russell on the far left with a group of employees, all wearing the Key West Handprint Fabrics line of clothing. While the Lilly Pulitzer shops sold only Lilly Pulitzer products, the Key West Handprint shops sold Lilly Pulitzer alongside their own brand. While the price point for the house brand was similar to Lilly Pulitzer's products, Vanda exclusives could be significantly more expensive. As their in-house designer, Vanda could request short runs of Susie Zuzak designs printed on more luxurious fabrics like silk chiffon or wool challis. It's difficult to see here, but in the ad on the left, the Lilly Pulitzer dress on the right is $70, and the Vanda original on the left is $225. According to June Klossing, Key West Handprint's retail manager, Lilly Pulitzer was a youth-oriented brand, and Vanda produced classic fashions for the mature woman. At their peak in the 1970s, Key West Handprint Fabrics had 22 shops around Florida and up the East Coast, and Lilly Pulitzer had 33. The two companies seemed to have an unwritten agreement not to open competing shops in the same town. If Lilly had Newport, Handprint had Nantucket, and when Lilly opened a shop in Nassau, the Bahamas, Handprint opened one in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Through the 1970s, both businesses continued to grow. Lilly Pulitzer adapted her silhouettes to the changing times, introducing maxi skirts, bell bottoms, and halters, but continued to produce them in Susie Zuzak prints. About once a month, she would come down to Key West from Miami to review the new design drawings and make her selections. She always got first pick, but if it was a design that Peter and Jim also wanted for handprint, she might only get an exclusive for a certain period of time or an exclusive colorway. After 20 years of beanstalk growth, as the local press called it, things took a turn in the early 1980s. Peter Pell died in an accident in 1981. In 1984, Lilly Pulitzer filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, jeopardizing the future of Key West handprint fabrics. Jim Russell felt that they could downsize and reorganize around supplying their own shops and product lines, and he had started that work, but he was already very ill and died of AIDS-related complications in 1985. The city of Key West did not want to see this business, that was a major employer and a downtown tourist destination, close. So a group of local businessmen purchased the company together with the design archive. So, despite a storage situation that was not, shall we say, museum quality, with Florida humidity and hurricanes, this remarkable archive of drawings was saved. Lilly Pulitzer retained only her trademark name, which she later sold, and the brand was relaunched in 1993 by Sugartown Worldwide. Because of that 1963 lawsuit I mentioned, all the Key West handprint fabrics designs were copyrighted, and Susie Zuzak's name appears on the copyright documents. The inscription by Zuzek also appears in the selvage of the fabrics, which were sold by the yard by both Key West handprint fabrics and Lilly Pulitzer. For years, collectors have been drawn to the vitality of the designs by the mysterious Zuzek and have used these selvage markings to identify the patterns on vintage Lilly Pulitzer garments. At the time of the bankruptcy and the turmoil around it, Susie was 65, and she decided to retire from textile design to focus on her own artwork. She painted, sculpted, and worked in ceramic tile. She completed a number of public art commissions, including a mural at the local public library. She taught, mentored younger artists, and ran a gallery in town. She was celebrated with a retrospective exhibition in Key West in 2001. If you're interested in learning more about Susie's artwork, you should search Suzie DePoo. She used her married name for her artwork, reserving the name Zuzek for her textile designs. Susie passed away in 2011, and Lilly Pulitzer followed in 2013. So I did not have the opportunity to meet either of them. I do want to take this opportunity to thank a few of the people who helped me piece this story together. First and foremost, Susie's daughters, Kathy and Martha DePoo, and her honorary daughter, Lee Martin. Lee and Martha were both textile designers at Key West Handprint and worked alongside Susie, so they were able to recreate the day-to-day operations upstairs in the art department. June Plossing, who was the retail manager, and Bobby McKenzie, who was in charge of the interior fabrics division, both worked closely with Jim Russell and were able to fill me in on what went on downstairs in the retail and wholesale operations. Corey Convertito, a curator at the Key West Art and Historical Museum, provided some great context about the history and economy of Key West. Martha was also able to connect me with half a dozen other former employees from all aspects of production. Every one of them said it was one of the best jobs they ever had, a truly joyful place to be. And every one of them said it could not have happened without Susie, that her imagination and her artistry were the foundation on which both of these companies were built. The exhibition was supposed to open last year, together with the beautiful publication from Rizzoli, but COVID happened. And so after a long delay, I was thrilled to be able to welcome Susie's daughters to the museum a few weeks ago for the opening of the exhibition, which appropriately we celebrated with a flower flash by Lewis Miller. think you're one slide ahead. Thanks. In the early days, Lilly Pulitzer was frank about her artistic skills. In October 1962, she told the New York Journal American, quote, "We were awfully lucky to find 4 boys in Key West who do their own silk screening. It's lucky because I can't draw a thing." But later, as she began to realize how powerfully people responded to Susie's prints, she became more circumspect, suggesting that the ideas behind the fabrics were hers. But according to everyone I interviewed who had worked at Key West Handprint Fabrics, Susie came in on her bike, went up to the second floor, sat at her table, and drew whatever came into her mind. And everybody left her alone because she drew such incredible things. So during her lifetime, Susie never really got credit for her contribution to the success and lasting appeal of the Lilly look. But there was this Lilly Pulitzer ad, which reads, "There will be a moment's silence while our prints do the talking." So I thought I would end there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And I have to say, as a man wearing a Lilly Pulitzer shirt, there have been times when people have literally. It's absolutely right. They capture the attention. Although I think now listening to your presentation, I think my shirt was a reissue and not an original. But c'est la vie. Well, anyway, I did want to ask just some sort of very basic questions. That I think will help some of our textile folks out there. This shirt is admittedly not an original, as I'm just found out, but it's a simple cotton plain weave. What were the actual underlying textiles that she used, that Lilly used, and that were also used as part of the line?
The vast majority of the yardage that the company produced was either 100% cotton broadcloth or a polycotton blend. Lots and lots of polycotton blend. As I said, they did do some specialty fabrics for Vanda exclusives. And they did later on in the 70s get into swimwear. And so they did do some printing of knits, which caused a whole lot of problems, apparently. But yes.
Say not the famous 70s staple double knit polyester.
There was double knit polyester. There was, yeah.
So. Any generation or any decade that gave us double knit polyester and Hamburger Helper and White Zinfandel had problems. But at least it sounds like Lilly rose to the challenge and was able to continue her silk screen with that. I had an interesting question, and one I had not thought of, about the Cincinnati-based artist Charlie Harper. Do you know, he was an illustrator and printmaker, predominantly of more, I guess to our eye would be mid-century modern style animals, things. This is an interesting question. Somebody asked, was it possible that Susie Zuzak knew him? In your research, would Cincinnati and Key West have ever come together in any way? Or have you seen any reference to his work in hers or vice versa? Or
I can see why the question is coming up. I have not seen anything to indicate that they ever actually met. But she was, studying commercial illustration. She was a trained designer. She lived in New York. She was very sophisticated, knowledgeable about a lot of different aspects of art and design. So I wouldn't be surprised if she were familiar with his work.
Okay, now that makes sense. I mean, there, as you pointed out, Susie was really well connected among other artists, and probably through galleries or something may have been familiar. But in truth, the vibrant, shocking, if you will, colors of Susie were kind of a far cry from the very cool, understated of Charlie's, but I thought that was an interesting question, and one that, now something I had always heard, and I ask this for, we have a great many vintage clothing collectors out there. Tell us about an authentication. I always heard in every Lilly design, you could find the Lilly signature somewhere in there. When can you date for us when that was always true as opposed to when that might have been true?
Right. I think that came about because of that 1963 lawsuit. So anything produced before 1963 maybe would not have the Lilly in it, but the things produced after 1963 would. And it varied a great deal. Like sometimes the Lilly is very obvious, like part of the design, and that got to be more and more true in the later years. But sometimes it's very, very concealed, oftentimes in the kind of like hatch mark work that would shape a figure. Like if you look at that design with the walruses as paisleys, there's hatch marks that are shaping the form of the walrus, and the name Lilly is like incorporated into that.
Well, tremendous, as we have a lot of vintage collectors and dealers, in fact, who follow our programs, and I know that they're always interested in authentication, and so that definitely helps, gives us. So remind us again, this is where can we see the exhibit?
The exhibit is at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, which is at 2 East 91st Street in New York. We're open Thursday through Monday, 10 to 6. And the show will be on view until January 2nd of next year.
Oh, tremendous. Well, now, probably, let me ask you one question you may not be able to answer, and one you probably
Only
will
one?
be able to answer. So the one that you may not is, what do you think is next for Lilly as a fashion brand? If you could just take this history that's so important now to most brands and where it is now. Just the other day, I saw the mall store. What do you think's next for Lilly? For us today?
You're right. This is not a question for me. I'm a textile historian, not a fashion forecaster. So
fair enough.
I'm going to punt on that.
All right. Now I promised you a question you could answer.
Thank you.
What's next for you? What is in your pipeline? What is in your interest, research-wise, and at the museum?
Yes, I am working on an exhibition and a book about a textile designer named Dorothy Levis, who had a huge life. She was very prominent. She was kind of the anti-Susie Zuzek in that during her lifetime, she was very famous. And since then has become forgotten. But she collaborated with all of the biggest architects and designers of the period, including Frank Lloyd Wright and Donald Deskey and Raymond Loewy and Henry Dreyfuss.
Well-known names to New Yorkers, right?
Yes, exactly. And she was a very close friend of Bonnie Cashin's, and they collaborated very frequently. So it's another great story of textile design and fashion design working hand in hand.
Oh, that's tremendous. Well, we'd love to have you back for that when it doesn't even have to be up and mounted, or the book doesn't even have to be out. We'd love to welcome you back. And I think it would be a really fascinating contrast to go from New York to Key West, all in your expertise on textiles. And
yes. And all about weaving. Dorothy Levis was
and all
weaver.
About weaving, absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, we appreciate that just very much, because we do, our textile people they're very passionate about it, and we want to make sure that they get what they need from us. So, I'm sorry, excuse me.
As they should.
Absolutely. Well, very exciting. Thank you so much for joining us. The questions have been amazing that we've gotten. I'm looking at them now, but what I'm actually seeing is how many people remember them and respond to them, and even today. So I think there's a great future for the vintage Lilly, the Lilly of Susie Zuzak, and I think that's its compelling history.
Yes, and maybe a new life for vintage Key West handprint fabrics fashions.
Well, before we ring off, tell us, can you update us about them?
Oh, I meant the vintage Key West handprint fabrics
Absolutely. I see.
line
Okay.
clothing,
Well, that's
which
right.
might not have been on people's radar before.
They became a hotel. That's right.
So yes, it's no longer in operation. But
All right. Well, we've gotten people from all over the world, including Guatemala and Toronto and London. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing your expertise about Susie Zuzak for Lilly Pulitzer.
well, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, take care.
You
Lovely to
too.
see you.